Good morning and welcome to everyone again. We're going to be in Philippians once again. If you wish to turn there, you may. The analogy that I included kind of in my title is friendly fire. And there are many, many examples of friendly fire, specifically in the military context, I guess is where it would be most predominant, where there's fire happening specifically. But also, it happens in other areas. And we're going to be looking at that a little bit here today, seeing what Paul was experiencing, what fire he was coming his direction, and what his response is to it. As the title says, Joyful Under Friendly Fire. We're going to start, I'm going to start reading verse 12. The text we're going to be looking at specifically is Philippians 1, 15 to 18. I'm going to start reading in verse 12 to get a little bit of context here. And I'll do that now. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. So in the previous verses, we see that Paul recognizes that his imprisonment or his setback is for Christ, and that the gospel is being proclaimed by others. And we see here that he draws a distinction between the two groups of people. And he uses the word some envious, or envy and rivalry. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry. Paul basically says that where he's at in prison at Rome, and the Christians around him envied him. In 2 Timothy 1, verse 16, there's a verse here, or two, that gives us a little bit of a tidbit of an insight of what might be going on. He says, May the Lord grant mercy to the household of one Sepphoris, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains, implying that there were some who were ashamed of his chains. Verse 17, But when he arrived in Rome, he searched for me earnestly and found me. Why did it take him searching earnestly to find Paul? One of the reasons may have been, I don't think the Christians there in Rome forgot about Paul. He was probably on their minds, it sounds like. He wasn't forgotten, but it doesn't seem that one Sepphoris had help in finding him. And maybe some reasons that they were unwilling to identify with Paul in the suffering that he was going through in prison. They could have accused him of being corrupt. I mean, he had these nice quarters that he was living in, his own place, and they could have said, well, he worked out some kind of a deal with the Roman authorities, was bribing them to stay there. Who knows? They could have had a number of different reasons that they were envious of him or didn't seem to like him very well. One thing seems to be clear is that both both of these parties that were preaching the gospel seemed to be preaching an orthodox or a right gospel. Because in Galatians 1, verse 6, he calls them out for turning to a different gospel. So it does appear that they were preaching the gospel of Christ. John Piper points out that Paul is more agitated when the gospel itself is defective than he is when the people who preach the true gospel are defective. Paul seems to say that the gospel preaching is good, but something was going on in their attitude or in their motive that he identifies a problem. So of the two types of gospel proclaiming people here, he says that some preach from goodwill or kindness or delight, or it's good, a good thing. And their motive, he says, is in verse 16, is they do it out of love. We could say that their goal is to assist Paul in what's going on in preaching and living the gospel. They would have respected and cared about Paul, and they viewed him as teammates on the same team and striving together. The others, he says, preach from envy and rivalry, or jealousy and quarreling or contention, the rivalry. Their motive, he says, is selfish ambition, which was not sincere, not pure, and not honest or good. And their goal is to afflict Paul while he's in prison. And they, according to 1 Corinthians 13:4, where it says love does not envy, they don't seem to love Paul, at least in a way that he could identify with as feeling. The story I'm going to tell here is compiled in part by Stephen Davey and various others. During the 1800s, many of you have heard of Charles Spurgeon. He pastored a downtown church in London that carried enormous weight as a leading voice of the gospel in that area and beyond. Spurgeon and his church were involved in the establishment of a college that was to train pastors. Years passed by, and what would be known as the downgrade controversy happened, where Spurgeon started denouncing a growing heresy among the pastors and churches who said that the atoning work of Christ was no longer held as necessary for salvation, and that the inspiration of Scripture no longer was believed by many. Spurgeon's church was in the association known as the Baptist Union, and since Spurgeon's voice carried significant weight in that, all the pastors and churches in London and beyond were effectively challenged to clarify their doctrine and called to embrace a clear gospel of Christ. Over the years, however, envy had done a silent work. Instead of these pastors and leaders rising to Spurgeon's warning, they instead challenged Spurgeon, pushing back. They accused him of exercising authority that he did not have and dared to make them look foolish. Spurgeon eventually resigned from the Baptist Union, but this action only made them angrier. And a movement grew within the union to censor Spurgeon, even though he was not a part of them. A meeting was held where Spurgeon was not present because he had resigned. A man named Henry Oakley wrote the following. He says, "I was present at the city temple where the motion was moved, seconded, and carried. I was there very early, but found only room in the aisle of the back gallery. I listened to the speeches, and the moment of voting came. When the motion of censuring Spurgeon came up, a forest of hands went up. Against the motion, called the chairman, but I did not see any hands, though history does record that there were 7 who voted not to censure Spurgeon. Without any announcement of numbers, the vast assembly broke into tumultuous cheering and cheering and cheering that went on. For some of the older men, their pent-up hostility against Spurgeon found a vent. It was a strange scene that I viewed almost with tears. I stood near a graduate from Spurgeon's college, whom I knew very well, and he went almost wild with delight at the censure of his generous teacher. I say it was a strange scene because this vast assembly was so outrageously delighted at the condemnation of one of their noblest and grandest leaders. When Spurgeon learned of the vote, he wrote a friend and ended it by writing, "Pray for me that my faith fail not." The effect that it had on him. And today, Charles Spurgeon is revered by some as one of the most effective English pastors in the last 250 years. And the Apostle Paul is revered as one of the greatest missionary statesmen and defenders of the faith in the history of the church. But he was pushed back against. Paul as well. To get a little bit of a grasp on this concept or word of envy, let's look at it a little bit. It's distinct from jealousy, which, kind of in a nutshell, is an intolerance of rivalry, where you have something, you already have something or possess something, and you want it's yours. That's jealousy. This is different. Envy is defined by Merriam-Webster is the painful or resentful awareness of an advantage that is enjoyed by another, joined with a desire to possess the same advantage. Dr. Bernard Golden says, "It's a feeling of emotional pain derived from making a social comparison. Envy arises when the other is viewed as being better than oneself. Those who study envy have historically suggested that there are 2 distinct types of envy. Benign envy, which serves as a motivation to achieve what another person has, kind of egging someone on, more of a good type, if we could say. And malicious envy, that underlies a desire to see another person fail or lose what they have achieved. And this is often accompanied by hostility or aggression. We see that envy feeds on comparison, comparing ourselves among ourselves. Jerry Bridges says that the reason we are tempted to envy is when there are enough things alike that the differences tend to strike us in the face. Whenever we compare ourselves with anyone whose circumstances seem better than ours, that's when we face the temptation to envy. And it is not restrictive to any specific category, across the board. Dorothy Sayers says that envy is the great leveler. If envy cannot elevate oneself to another person's status, it will actively drag that person down, because we may find it's easier to sabotage another person's success than to respect them and develop our own. I think that envy comes from a view of self, a view of oneself that is either distorted or diminished. Like, what is the root, or digging down in? I don't think it's not as much about possessions as it is wanting the perception of not being inferior. Identity and self-perception. It's not as much about me too as it is me instead. We want what someone else has, not something else like it Maybe so, but sometimes we want that. Pride would say, hey, look at me. Where envy would say, you're not looking at me and you should be. That someone else has or is something. And in order to feel valued or accomplished in that realm of comparison, I need to measure up with them, and I'm not content with who I am. One thing about self-worth is I believe self-worth is intrinsic, or it's a fact that we have value, created in God's image. But for the envious, we could say that self-worth is comparative, comparing someone to someone else. And we see here the Roman Christians, in wanting to afflict Paul, it doesn't seem to have worked. And it also revealed it revealed to Paul where they were at, where their heart was. James 3:16 says that for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. Paul does not say what specifically the Roman Christians were doing, but kind of gets at the motive of what they were doing. Because it seems sort of weird to envy a guy who is in jail and seems to be kind of at the bottom of life. He may have been viewed as he is going to die. He's on death row. Why are they envying him? And I think one thing that Paul had that they would have said that they didn't is the popularity among Christians, not necessarily in Rome, but among Christians specifically in Asia and in Jerusalem and other areas, and that they wanted that, the influence that he may have had before Caesar himself, or he does mention within Caesar's household. Ligonier.org says that these Roman evangelists were not moved by a true love for the lost people and a desire to see God glorified. They were moved by jealousy for the apostles' name and impact on the church of their day. And with him behind bars, these individuals sought to increase their own recognition and gain a following larger than the apostles. The Christians in Rome wanted Paul's influence and popularity and were envious of the ministry that he had. He was still writing letters. He was still very well respected by some. And they seemed to have an attitude that they wanted to increase, but they also wanted Paul to decrease or make Paul feel ineffective or irrelevant even. They didn't see what Paul was doing as mutual success. Their envy had blinded them, so it was about them and not what Paul was doing. But what's interesting is Paul, looking at them, he does feel that mutual success. They didn't. They had isolated themselves in a box almost, where they thought what they were doing was for what they were doing. And Paul's like, hey, the gospel's being preached. What then? Verse 18. What then? And how many of us think that? Because I don't think envy with myself does not make me say, what then? That's where I might start scheming something. But Paul's response here is, what then? The first point, which I don't even know if I mentioned, was that friendly fire is still fire. It still causes damage, even to ourselves, and as well as to others. As we see the what happened with Spurgeon wanting, pray for me that my faith fail not. Even friendly fire amongst Christians, especially there's a book called Respectable Sins, and envy is one of them. The sort of ones that are not necessarily out there and easy to see, but some of the harder ones. But they still are destructive and cause damage, even if it's to ourselves or to others. What then? The next point is resist retaliation, because Paul seems to have done that. He chose not to retaliate. Some of the responses that he could have had was to just completely ignore it or deny it. Like, we're really on good terms over here. They're on good terms with me. He could ignore it. He would not have had to bring this up to the Philippians, but he says he wants them to know this. Or he could have defended himself against them, or criticized or attacked the Roman Christians. And that's often the easy response, to criticize back. And we see that we can't control the words or actions that are said or done against us, but we do determine our responses. And Paul here shows a godly response to his rival teammates. He seems to care little about being popular in Rome. That is a hard thing. I wonder what all Paul went through to get to that spot. He seems to be concerned far more with Jesus' popularity and the fact that these other people were spreading and making Jesus more popular, even if he was not increasing in popularity. It seems that his goal was love-motivated proclamation of Christ, and not envy, and not rivalry. And he says a little bit later, "In that I rejoice." No wonder he had a joy, or could have a joy amidst this. The motive that he had was not what they had. Properly aligned goals that he would have had allowed him to not live in envy of them, and to also be able to interact well with those who did envy him. Because I find if my goal is to build up myself and I see someone else succeeding, of course I'm going to envy. Of course I'm going to look inward and try to do something about it that is not a good response. And there seems to be a difference between being attacked personally and taking it personally. Because Paul does seem to be, he does seem to be attacked, or there was fire going at him. He doesn't take it personally. It was directed at him. They wanted him to afflict him. They wanted him to feel attacked. But he doesn't take it that way. There's a difference between taking it personally and just saying, "What then?" We do see that Paul cared about what he defended, or what Paul cared about, he defended. He did have goals and he did have values. Paul did, and the Roman Christians did. And both of their goals and both of their values from both sides had come out. And his not responding with criticism helped diffuse whatever tension that the Philippians could have felt Paul had. Galatians 5:13, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Paul was not taking part in that, biting and devouring one another. And later, in Philippians 2, chapter 2, verse 2, he says, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. Philippians, they did this. Let's respond differently. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. If fire comes our way, let's resist retaliation and seek God's priorities. Verse 18, only that in every way, whether pretense or truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. I think the difference with Paul was that he could see God's goals for him and his role in them. God's goals became Paul's priorities. And the energy that he could have spent pushing back, he spent a refocused energy on good things, even encouraging the Philippians not to respond the same. As a servant of God, Paul rejoices in seeing God at work, knowing that God uses imperfect people to do his work, and that we're all growing and we need grace, giving grace to those who were attacking him. Paul seems to want the Philippians to know the better way to spread the gospel, not with prejudice and malice, seeking to win others to Christ for their reputation, but in love. That means if others are successful, he rejoices with them. And he's not envious, even if the Roman Christians got credit. We don't see Paul reacting to them in envy. So we could ask, how did Paul get there? Because I expect that within every one of us, there is a battle between the concept of love and envy that leads to rivalry. We're so quick to see faults in other people. We can encourage and pray, but we can't change someone else who's doing that. Paul couldn't change the Roman Christians who were responding that way. I don't know where I heard this, but this is kind of a paraphrase from somewhere else. That if we want to change the world or influence the world in a good way, we start with ourselves. Where or how might we be envious and see rivalries in others? And where might we be one sending friendly fire to someone else who is also a fellow believer? Do I attempt to criticize, to outdo another in something that's not of love? Do I walk around kind of with unspoken competitions? Do I find myself comparing myself with another and feeling discontentment when I do? Am I resentful towards another person's success in whatever it would be, in anything? John Piper also says that what is more astonishing is that this sinful behavior is just the opposite of the way that the gospel itself would incline a person to act. So they are hypocrites. They preach the gospel and then contradict in the very motives the gospel that they are preaching. a life in Christ through the gospel, I believe, is the antidote to envy and rivalry. We can't just accomplish that from ourselves. It's the transformation of Christ. And we see that the Roman, the Jews, their envy and jealousy of Christ, of the popularity that Jesus had, we see that was a very big motivating factor in taking Jesus to the cross. And Jesus still responds to them, offering to forgive them from the very cross itself. The gospel of grace extends grace to those who don't deserve it. I'm challenged that my personal ambitions are to be given to Jesus and laid at the foot of the cross as a living sacrifice that is holy and acceptable to God, Romans 12:1. I don't know of another way that envy goes away. Giving it to Christ, sacrificing it before Him, and accepting His motive, His goals. Jesus calls us into a transformative communion with Him. Even far back in Psalm 139:23, where David says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there is any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." I might think that I don't envy, and then God shows me something else. And in John 21, verse 22, I'm challenged by Jesus' response to one of the disciples here, where Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come," or that John remain until I come, "what is that to you? You follow me." Jesus reaches out to the specific individual, to the heart, and says, don't be comparing yourselves. Even the disciples were doing this, comparing themselves. And Jesus says, you follow me. What a challenge that is. And then from that position of following Christ, of asking His grace to transform our mind, we can follow Luke 6:28, where He says, "Bless those who curse you and pray for those who abuse you." And I have no doubt that Paul did that. That Paul was praying for those who were not on his team, did not view themselves as being that. And there is only one person. Well, I say that we shouldn't compare ourselves among ourselves, and that is true. I find that there's one person we are called in Scripture to follow, or to compare ourselves to. Ephesians 4:13, "Until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure and the stature of the fullness of Christ." Comparing ourselves to Christ. That is a humbling thing to do. We might feel better if we're comparing ourselves to other people because they have issues and we have issues and it kind of works. But when we compare ourselves to Christ, we can't do that. We can't walk away from that feeling good if we're honest with ourselves. As children of God, let us focus on abiding with and following Jesus to the best of His ability that He works within us. And allow Jesus' assessment of our value to be what gives us security and identity. because I believe each person is of intrinsic value given by God, of intrinsic value to God. We could say that he is by far the most accurate estimator of each of us. If you want to know what our value is, don't ask someone else, or don't compare to someone else. We ask God, what is the value that we have to God? Because the fact is, we're loved by God. And I think when we find ourselves grasping that a little bit more as life continues on, the fact that we are loved by God and finding security in him, our envy is less and less. We are loved by God no matter how much fire we may be receiving, whether friendly or otherwise. There's always an opportunity to be envious and to make rivals. There's always that opportunity. But let us remember that friendly fire is still fire. Let's resist retaliation and seek God's priorities. And when friendly fire, or fire of any kind, comes at us through the air in our direction, let's not shoot it back. Instead, let us pray for, encourage, and seek to build up God's church, Christ's church. Let's come to prayer.